Good afternoon and good morning. We will begin the broadcast in about just another minute or so. We're watching attendees come into the room, so we're going to let you join our webinar, and we will begin in about a minute. Thank you for being here. Okay, well, welcome to today's webinar. This webinar to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series is brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families Children's Bureau. Today's webinar will provide an overview on the definitions and types of APDs while providing some practical guidance on the development of CCWIS APDs. Webinar participants are encouraged to engage in this discussion by asking questions and participating in polling questions throughout this webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Practical Guidance to Developing CCWIS APDs. Again, we'd like to encourage you all to participate throughout the webinar. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You can submit general questions or comments via the Q&A panel, which should be located typically at the top of your screen in the ribbon there, or maybe on the bottom. And you can submit those throughout the webinar. We will be monitoring those questions. As I said earlier, there will also be some polling opportunities for you to participate in. And so we ask that you do participate in those polls. And then after the webinar, you may also continue to email your questions, specific questions regarding your state or Title IV agency to your federal analyst or to cwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov. You can also ask questions using the raise hand feature, which you should be able to find in the panelist window. We'll be monitoring that as well. Today's speakers will include Nicole Harder-Schaefer and Teresa Young. Both are federal analysts in the Division of State Systems, Children's Bureau Administration for Children and Families. Today, the purpose of today's webinar is to review APD definitions and types, provide practical guidance on developing CCWIS APDs, suggest ways to save time and simplify the process, share things to avoid, and improve agency and federal partnerships. But before we get into that, we do have a couple polling questions that we'd like for you to participate in. And this first polling question asks that you rate your experience or confidence level in developing APDs. Your options to respond here are, I am a beginner, APDs are new to me. Somewhat confident, I have developed a few APDs. Phone a friend, I do them, but I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm pretty confident, I understand most of the requirements. And last option here is confident, sign me up for a consulting gig. And so that poll has been launched. If you could respond to that now, that would be great. And once we get the majority of you responding, we'll go ahead and close it out. So we'll leave it open just for a few more seconds. Okay, here are the results. Vast majority of you, 65%, rate yourself as a beginner and that APDs are new. And then the other 25% or so are somewhat to, many of you, 15% said, hey, I'm doing them, but I'm not really sure what I'm doing. It's the phone a friend option. I like that. And then a few of you are pretty confident and are very confident. So that's excellent. That will be very helpful to our speakers as they deliver the content to you. We appreciate your response on that. We do have another polling question, so stay with us as we look at this next question, which asks you this. For today's webinar, Children's Bureau, our federal analysts, our speakers should focus the most time on which of these things? APD definitions and requirements, practical guidance on developing CCWIS APDs, time-saving tips and things to avoid, facilitating deep dive discussion on a particular requirement, or suggestions for strengthening CB, and agency partnerships. We'll give you a few seconds to respond to this poll as well. Thank you. All right, looks like many of you have responded. Thank you for responding. Give you just a couple seconds more to respond to this. There we go. All right. Okay, so here the majority, 60% of you would like practical guidance on developing CCWIS APDs. And next, about a quarter of you are interested in the time-saving tips and things to avoid. And then about 16% of you are also interested in the APD definitions and requirements. Very few on the deep dive and the partnership discussion. So that's going to be very helpful for our speakers today to know who kind of we're speaking to and what you'd like them to focus their time on the time that we have today. So again, thank you very much for participating in those polls. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Nicole Harder-Schaefer. Nicole?
Thanks, Phil. So we're going to start off with the APD definitions and types. Next slide. So we wanted to start off with the vision or the ideal APD process for us. So at the Division of State Systems, our mission is to improve child welfare programs by creating better access to data and supporting innovation and technology solutions. We really are here to help and provide technical assistance. We definitely want to have a shared collaborative problem-solving process with our states and tribes and districts. We truly do not expect perfection. We care more about whether the APD reflects your Title 40 agency's project and plans, and truly our goal is to get to yes. So next slide, please. So APD Defined, the advanced planning document means it's a recorded plan of action to request a funding approval for a project which will require the use of automated data processing services or equipment. APDs are required for both CCWIS and non-CCWIS systems. And we wanted to provide the legal references. 45 CFR 95610 are the APD regulations, and 45 CFR 135550 through 58 are the CCWIS regulations. Next slide, please. The purpose of an APD is to request federal financial participation, present a business case for information technology acquisitions, demonstrate that the Title 40 agency, state or district tribe has conducted the appropriate IT project planning, and establish that they have sufficient resources and will follow the disciplined process to achieve their project objectives. Next slide. So we'll go into types of APDs. During the planning, design, development, and implementation of a project may include a planning APD, an implementation APD, an operational APD, and as needed. So those are the basic types of APDs. So the planning APD assists the 40 agency with defining the problem or what's needed to be addressed, determining whether a CCWIS is in the Title 40 agency's best interest and aligns with the agency business needs. So taking the time to understand the CCWIS regulations, understand what it is that the state or tribe or district currently has, and whether a CCWIS system is going to provide the functions that are necessary, what will be shared, what is possible to be leveraged, and taking the time to consider the alternatives, your options, your opportunities, and really what are the constraints, what are the impediments that may be difficult to overcome. So developing the project management plan and the resource plan is crucial, and estimating the total project budget, defining the requirements of a general system design or solicitation documents, conducting the feasibility or cost benefit analysis, making sure that you take the time to develop stakeholder engagement and a strategy, determining and developing the implementation approach, and really, really spending some time developing your plans for data quality. Next slide, please. So the Planning APD regulations, while a Planning APD is optional, it is highly recommended. This is a relatively brief document, 6 to 10 pages. This isn't, War and Peace. We don't want it to be a book by any stretch of the imagination. It needs to have the statement of need. You need to have your project management plan, your budget, your streamlined alternative analysis, a description of how the agency will develop the requirements, as well as an acquisition summary. Next slide. So now we move on to the implementation APD. And these, we've separated this out in two parts. So an implementation APD is required. You should have the results of your planning APD activities in your implementation APD. The fund.
Hey, Nicole, we might have lost you. You broke up for just a moment. Teresa, do you want to jump in here until we get Nicole back?
Sorry, you will also have your proposed activity schedule.
Okay. Hey, Nicole, this is Phil. We lost you around your third bullet on this slide. Are you able to cover that again for us?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
So you'll also have your data quality plan, your automated function checklist, the description of your scope and your activities, and your proposed activity schedule. Next slide. So you will have identified the staff and resources that you need. So we can't stress this enough to make sure that you have the right staff and the right resources in place to make your project successful. You also need your proposed budget, your statement of the length of the use of the system, cost allocation methodology, your security and interface requirements, your disaster recovery and business procedures, and any additional requirements as noted in 45 CFR 1355-54 through 1355-57. Next slide. So your annual APD update is due 60 days prior to the authorization expiration. So you need, if your document ends on September 30th, then you need to turn it in 60 days prior. So your project activity report will contain the status of tasks and milestones, your risk management plan, any problems or delays that the project experienced, your project deliverables that have been completed and that are unfinished, your updated project activity schedule, your revised budget, both operational and development for the project's lifecycle, your data quality plan, where you're at with your biennial review, and you're going to have your automated functions checklist. Your data quality plan really should be looked at every single time that your document is turned in. It should continue to be updated. We don't expect to see the same data quality plan year over year. Next slide, please. So you will also have your detailed expenditures and both actuals and projected. Any changes that have been made to the cost allocation methodology for both development and operational costs. Your acquisition summary should contain the type and the scope of the contract, the procurement strategy, the estimated cost, and the not to exceed amount, the time frame of the contract, and the software ownership rights. Next slide. So your operational APD. Once a system has functionally been used by caseworkers to administer the Title IV program, brief 2 pages high-level document that is submitted annually to report your activities planned in an upcoming year, any planned acquisitions, your budget for maintenance and operations, the CCWIS operational cost allocation, the non-CCWIS operational cost allocation, and the cumulative of all of the project expenditures to date. Next slide. So when it is that you need to send in an as-needed advanced planning document update, they are submitted when the state or tribe anticipates a significant change to the project, which can be scope or system concept, costs or schedules, changes to the cost allocation methodology, and changes to project acquisitions. Next slide, please. So an as-needed update responds to approval conditions, funding on a phased implementation basis, incremental project expenditures, schedule extension of 60 days for milestones, major changes in scope, changes in cost allocation, and changes to cost benefiting projections. The as-needed update regulations part 2 changes to the acquisition summary. So if there are any changes to any contracts with regard to type and scope of the contract, procurement strategies, estimated costs, not to exceed amount, timeframes. You must include the statement of software ownership rights, which are at 45 CFR 95617, and a new acquisition and or contract that was not in your annual APD. Next slide. So, CCWIS considerations. Required for an IAPD is your data quality plan, your annual updates, and your OAPD. So like I said earlier, the data quality plan must be included in all of your submissions, and it should be updated. Your annual updates with your data quality plan are not static. They should also reflect your biennial reviews when appropriate. Your automated function checklist is required for your IAPD. your annual updates, your OAPDs. So child welfare contributing agencies are required for your IAPD and your annual update. You need to provide updates on where the project is with the evaluations of your child welfare contributing agencies, and if necessary, provide information on any changes. You should have your cost allocation methodology, both for CCWIS and non-CCWIS. Next slide. So understanding the difference between your single ops and your multi-ops. So your single ops are for child welfare, Title IV funding from Children's Bureau with or without CMS or OCSE involvement. A multi-op project benefits multiple programs, meaning 2 or more, both Children's Bureau, CMS, or OCSE, which are within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Note that FNS requests are separate from HHS. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Therese Young, who will go over the practical guidance.
Thanks, Nicole. I think we're going to do another polling question. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. What are the top 3 barriers you experience in developing APDs? And I'm going to read these, so bear with me a little bit. That you have. Do you think the barriers that you find are that you have problems with your internal governance, or maybe that you don't think you have the authority to really, make things happen that you're committing to in your APD, or that you have difficulties between sort of the child welfare program and the IT staff being on the same page? Maybe you experience that you've got an active vendor in there and they're kind of making the decisions and running the show. Or maybe you're in a situation where you just don't feel like you have the time that you really need to do the APDs or the resources. Maybe you feel like your analyst isn't clear, with expectations. Or maybe you think, okay, my state wants to do a CCWIS, but they really don't have a shared vision, for how we do that or for the detail of how we're going to do a CCWIS. Or maybe you think, I really don't understand the CCWIS requirements. Or you're one of the projects that Nicole just mentioned that we sometimes refer to as a multi-optive project that's benefiting multiple programs. And your partnership that you need to make those projects work well with sister state agencies is challenging to work through the issues. So just mark the 3 that you think are the biggest barriers. If you have 3, if you only have 1 or 2, that's great. Maybe you have other issues, I guess we have down there as well. Do we have results or have folks fallen asleep?
Hey, Rush, this is Nick. Would you please close the poll once we get to 80%? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, maybe it took people a little time to work through those. Thank you so much. Interesting. Okay, so it looks like the most common issue is really the internal governance problems. And then also there's quite a few on the other issues. So it'd be really helpful for us to know kind of what some of those other issues are. So either in the open mic session when we're doing question and answers, or maybe if you feel comfortable sending in some of those to us, or talking to your analyst, whatever method you feel comfortable communicating those other issues, we would be interested in understanding what those are, because we'll use this information in thinking about future webinars or topics that we might need to delve into a little bit more. So thank you for answering those. Okay. If we move on to the next slide. Okay, so one thing, we were talking about practical guides at this point, and we've noted some common sense practical guidance to sort of help demystify the APD process. And honestly, we put these together just talking with the DSS analysts and staff about their experiences in reviewing APDs and working with agencies. You may have other practices that you feel that you use in your organization that are helpful. And again, we encourage you to share those in the chat box or during the Q's and A's. It sounds really obvious to review the requirements and the CCWIS requirements, but that's the first sort of practical tip. It's always best to do that, when things are not due, and to look at those. And if you see some weird stuff and you read it and you think, I really don't understand what this means, you should bring that up to your analyst and have conversations, about that before your APDs do. And I think most of you probably already do that, but if you don't, you should feel comfortable doing that. Another thing that we often talk to states about is making sure they know kind of who is the primary owner of the APD document. And is it clear on your team, what responsibilities they have that contribute, to the APD? So if you think about, what kind of qualities does a person need, to be able to do APDs well? Obviously, you need someone who really has a strong understanding of the requirements and of your project. Ideally, it's a person who can kind of bridge child welfare and information technology disciplines. And if you can't find that, then maybe having a strong leader or partnership between two different individuals. It might not have to always be one person, but maybe it's still clear. Maybe there's two leads, and one of them specializes in technical discipline, and the other one might be a child welfare person who understands the business really well. It should be somebody who can set expectations and due dates for others if you need information. So if you have somebody in this role and nobody pays any attention to them, when you kind of need things, or they're in a, that's problematic. I mean, you need someone who, has some authority in your agency to set expectation in terms of what kinds of things you need to complete it and due dates for them. And, the other kinds of skills are obvious, but, having good project management skills and communication skills, good writer, somebody who's honest and upfront, and somebody who kind of focuses on what's important and can get to the point. This other practical guide that Nicole started to talk a little bit about has to do with setting the due date for when your APD is due. And this can be very challenging for the multi-optive projects because, Medicaid typically sets their APD due dates based on the federal fiscal year. But Children's Bureau does not. Children's Bureau really tries to work with the state to allow the state to figure out, what due date is going to result in the best product, and when am I going to have all the information that I need, for my APD. So typically, your budget needs to run for a 12-month period. But we do encourage you to think about what 12-month period makes the most sense for you. So you should consider when your state budget process is done. It's very helpful to know how much state money you have for the project before you need to do your APD. But other kinds of things you might want to consider is, if you have other federal audits that are going on, if you have state activities or audits, other projects, things that are going on, you should think about that, when you're setting up the regular time frame for when your APD will be due. So, what that usually means is that that first APD might have sort of a wonky time period. It might be a little less than a year, it might be a little more. But generally, what that's going to do is set up a regular date where your APD is due 60 days prior to when that budget period ends. So thinking about setting up that initial budget period in a way that is going to get you, a due date that makes sense for your state and your project is worth taking the time to kind of think through that. And, talking with your analyst about how to get there. And most of the analysts, are pretty open to working with you to do that. It gets a little complicated for those states who've got multiple APDs, but we really do try to do that and work with you on setting that date. We're going to talk a little bit more further in this presentation about formats and templates, but obviously, thinking through to the extent that you can on your project, what kind of format and template makes sense to you. We don't offer a standard template, but we do give feedback, to states when they are putting together their own templates. So the most obvious, places maybe to start is maybe your automated function checklist that Nicole talked about, maybe your table of organization or your schedule or your budget, or even just the body of your APD. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next suggestion sounds again pretty obvious, to institute a quality review process before it's submitted. But this is one that we really think is important and could save you a lot of headache, and also us a lot of headache with not needing to go back and forth and trying to clarify things. So I think you should really think about what kind of QA process do I have for reviewing this APD? Is it just the leaders of the project kind of toward the end, right before it's due, reads it and make sure it's okay? Or do I have a disciplined, kind of QA process that involves multiple reviews of the document? If you have a communications department, maybe you don't, but maybe you have somebody in your organization who's really good with the communications. You may want to think about instituting, additional review, with a communication person just looking at it. We talked a little bit about, attachments. Most of the analysts try to review drafts if we can, if our workload is not that heavy. But if you can't have your analyst look at your whole document again, going over these particular attachments or areas of the APD can be really helpful. So maybe you want to set aside time, just to look at the data quality plan or the cost allocation methodology. And we did issue the CCWIS self-assessment tools in the recent PRA, at least the first 6 of those. Again, these are the kinds of things that would be helpful for you to review with your analyst before your APD is due. Next slide, please. So thinking about things you can just do on a routine basis. Again, it sounds very obvious of keeping people informed and making sure you have a unified vision. And that you have support from all the different, stakeholders and players that you need for your project and your APD, but this is easier said than done. But it's really important, and the time that you spend, making sure that others understand what you've committed yourself to in an APD and what your APD goals are, and what your timeframes are, the better it will be, in the long run, for making sure that you're giving CB an APD that has validity. As Nicole said, we don't expect perfection. You should share and manage your risks. So this one, along with the other one, that talks about noting accomplishments but acknowledge challenges and the work that you have to do. When we see APDs that kind of just lay it out, like this is kind of what we're struggling with. Here's where we are, kind of with this technology or with this enhancement or this part of the solution that we want to develop. Here's the challenges, the issues that we've had. Here are sort of the steps that we're taking to mitigate that. When we see those kinds of things, it actually, we actually look at that and it provides comfort basically to the Children's Bureau because A, we see you have an understanding kind of what the risks are on your project. And B, that you're being honest, with Children's Bureau about what they are. And then also you have a plan for managing them. We get worried, when we see APDs that don't talk about any risks or challenges. If we get an APD that says everything is wonderful, we look at that and say, is that a CCWIS project? I mean, we expect, that there will be issues. If things change in your system, again, Nicole mentioned the as needed, and we would be expecting updates. And we know that the automated function checklist and the ramifications to cost allocation is a new part of CCWIS that we are, it's not new to CCWIS, but it's new from SACWIS. So it's a new thing that we've all been kind of adjusting to. So it's important when you are doing an update that you do kind of think to yourself, is this something that impacts my cost allocation? Or is this a change from my automated function checklist? And again, the last one is, you can't do it alone. You do have to distribute the work, but it should be a really managed process. If you're in a situation where it seems last minute or there's no organization to sort of the way you approach this work, then I would take a step back and say, how can we get a handle on this and handle it more, as a repeatable process. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to move to talking about time-saving tips. And I've outlined some of them. We're going to get into detail a little bit more about taking care of administrative stuff and sort of looking at the structure of your APD, talking about cost allocation. Again, talking a little bit about the self-assessment tools and attachments. Thoughts about reusing APD language. Thoughts about summary data. The budget, and how you deal with outstanding conditions. Next slide, please. So the first one is just take care of all the administrative things you can ahead of time. Again, these things seem pretty basic, but they're going to save you time. If you already know where the submission instructions are or what you need to do in order to submit an APD, it's on our website. We have a link in this presentation. It'd be helpful to understand what those submission requirements are ahead of time, and to make sure that your agency has the right signature authority, for the person who's going to sign that APD with the Children's Bureau. We have to make sure, that we're receiving a document from somebody who's authorized at the state to submit it. This next one seems very obvious, but we don't see it that often, and it's really helpful when you do it, which is, put your funding request in your cover letter. It really, one thing you really want to make easy is for your federal analyst to understand what funding you are asking for, and again, it might be CCWIS, it might have some non-CCWIS component, but we really need it to make it easy and have it be consistent. Again, if we see like different numbers all over the place and we're having to hunt quite a bit or redo numbers or try to figure out what really, is the state asking for, that's going to delay things. So make it very easy, for us to understand what it is you're asking for and make those numbers consistent. Some states like to get copies of their cost allocation approval letters. If you like to do that, we do like to see them. That sometimes is a helpful practice to just get in the habit of always doing. Then you have them, you can include them, in your APD, and it's sort of showing, if the state has an approved PA cap, or if the state, is wherever the state is basically, and getting their PA cap approved. Keeping just an updated table of organization will save you time. Having one that sort of shows vendor and state resources and keeping that up to date. Again, that's something that you can do ahead of time. That's helpful. And sort of looking at the structure of your APD and saying, hey, is anything changed? Do I like this table of contents? Again, our suggestion to you is to set due dates for various aspects of your APD throughout the year. If you only sort of have that target date for, maybe right when it's due or a month when it's due, you're probably going to run into problems. So stepping back and saying, what do we need to get accomplished, in this next year, and where is there a natural fit between the due dates or, some of these artifacts that I need to get for my APD, and how can I sort of spread that out, throughout the year. We've encouraged you to ask questions, and we're all learning. There's no bad question. So if you're struggling with something or you don't understand something, call your analyst. That's why we're here. And, we like when you ask questions because we know you want to do a good job. Okay, go ahead and move the slide, please. So I'm sharing with you here, this is just an example that one of the other analysts shared with me that I thought was really interesting, that one of the states that she works with created. And what that state did, and this is just an example, we're not saying go out and do this, but we're trying to just say, think creatively about, how you format your APD. And this state decided to sort of expand the format that they use for their automated function checklist. So one thing they did, instead of just using the standard format that was issued when CCWIS regulation was passed, is they made sure that they just didn't, name the function, but they included a narrative that described what that function was in the chart. So that's very helpful, to us. It makes clear, basically, kind of at a high level. I'm not saying that it has to have every specification, but at a high level, kind of, describing what the functionality covers. What's included in it. What is it supposed to do? And then, they have, they included, the things that are required. But you can see here where they added some additional things, is it on the, development budget? Is it an operational status on the budget? Is it in a non-CCWIS? Kind of where is it, in the budget? And then a status update, what are we doing now, with this? And what do we hope to do? So sometimes we do see that in the body of the APD, and that's fine, that's good. We're not telling you again to run out and use this format. We're just sharing with you, the creativity that one state used for the format of their automated function checklist. And, if you're going to create things like this, again, it's always something good to talk with your analyst about, to say, hey, we've looked at this. We would like to do it this way. We think this makes the most sense. Is this understandable to you, and have those conversations. And most of the time, we're pretty open. You have the freedom, as long as the information is there, to have a format that's going to work for you. Next slide, please. So now we're talking about cost allocation. And again, as I mentioned before, this has been a learning, for all of us in terms of, we have a lot of flexibility in CCWIS, but with that flexibility came additional responsibilities for all of us. To make sure that, the parts of the system that we're allocating to 4E meet the regulation requirements. So again, recognizing that your automated function checklist impacts your cost allocation methodology, having that sort of tied together will help you and help us, and help you recognize that when you make a change, kind of in that automated function checklist, it could impact your cost allocation. We mentioned technical bulletin number 5. Most of you have read that. If you haven't read that, please do. And this next bullet point really is just something we're seeing, is that it looks like most states are getting more comfortable with making sure that they have a development cost allocation. But we have to make sure that even when a system is in operations now, that we have, the operational cost allocation for the project. And it used to be, under CCWIS that would be, kind of just handled through the PA cap, but now we kind of have to take that extra step for the operational APD to make sure that if there's duplication or inconsistently used functionality, that we're taking that into account for that operational cost allocation. So it's a little bit more, an extra step. And you want to make sure that your APD, if you're in an operational status, has that information, and that the PA cap is updated, as you need to have it updated. Next slide. We mentioned the self-assessment tools. We know only 6 of them have been issued at this point. We're looking at your comments. Thank you so much to all of you who've been giving us feedback on those all along the way. And also to those of you who sent in feedback. We really want those tools to be useful to you. You're not required to attach them to your APD, but we do think it could be helpful, if you are using those and kind of looking at them and documenting, here's where we are, with this various, like maybe with our intake module, and you've identified some areas that, maybe have some gaps that you want to work on, using those tools will help you document that in your APD and also help facilitate discussion with Children's Bureau, with your analyst, about where you are on those efforts. Next slide, please. Reusing APD language is also a time saver. We're not saying reuse them year after year from APD to APD, but there are a lot of activities, and especially if you're on the business side in the child welfare program area, where information that you provide in your APD can be used to meet other federal report requirements, or state requirements. So if you have, regular summaries that you need to give your stakeholders, or maybe you do state user group meetings, if you format your APD updates, around what you're planning on doing, what your language is to describe your projects, in a sort of easy way to describe what you're going to do, you can just reuse that information. You don't have to recreate it. You can just copy paste. In your CFSR statewide assessment, there's a whole section basically on the IT system. Again, rather than creating the wheel, recreating the wheel, you can just, for the most part, cut and paste, sections of your APD to use in that part of that document. Same thing goes with your 4B plan. There's a section, there's an annual plan and then your 5-year plan. And there's a section of that plan where it asks, what have you been doing with your APD or with your, automated system, with your child welfare system? If you just cut, paste, this is what we planned on, and maybe you're already doing these things, but, there's no reason to have to redo all of that work if the information is captured somewhere else. And then, lastly, just using it honestly as a way to help train your team in terms of the requirements. Maybe you have people that are kind of coming and going, or they really don't know what the requirements are. Working on an APD sort of helps everyone get on the same page about what's required. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Providing meaningful summary data. We don't want to see APDs that just have information, honestly, that provides us statistics, but they're not very meaningful. It doesn't really give us a picture of what's going on in your project. But there might be some just standard information, standard report data kind of that you include in your APD that could be helpful. The first one is probably the most critical and is really kind of how are you getting user feedback about, about what you're creating, about what you're developing or deploying. What kind of communication venues do you have, and what kind of information or data, do you have from your users, and how are you using it? Is really, some of you are doing survey data. That's one way, to get information. We love to see that. Others of you, might have user groups and meet frequently. And, some of you are using methodologies that have consistent feedback, but, that's very meaningful to us. We're always looking for that, and it's just going to make your project, better in the long run. These other kinds of normal kinds of data that sometimes we see that can be helpful is just a, sense of what your backlog is and how well you are resolving, defects in your system, what kind of, testing plans you have. Basic system monitoring. We don't need to see, every detail, but, some sense of how often your system goes down, or whether or not you're meeting the metrics of, how fast your system is processing things and that it's available to users. Summaries of, how effective your deployment process is. And then we already talked just about actual costs, but those are just normal kinds of data. You may have other ones that give us just a sense of kind of, how the project is functioning. Okay, next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about the budget, and this is probably an area where, aside from cost allocation, that we probably have the most back and forth really between CB and state. We talked a little bit about having that funding request in your submission letter, and having that those numbers be consistent throughout your document is really helpful. Sometimes we get APDs and we need to have a budget narrative and it needs to be updated, it's describing the line items on your budget. And it's, noting if there are, differences in estimated and actual cost, those kinds of things we use that budget narrative for. Sometimes, we see people seem to struggle a little bit with giving us the detail that we need, which is that by quarter, we need to see estimated and actual costs. And again, separating out your operational and development costs and your CWIS and non-CWIS costs. If you have other federal funders in your project, those need to be clear as well. You should always double check, make sure your budget period is what you want it to be, because again, that budget period sets your due date for the APD. And sometimes people just use the same format they've had, they don't update that budget period, and then you end up with a due date that you really, that you don't want. So look at that budget period, make sure that it matches, what you want it to for the, for the date to fall 60 days before that period ends, would be when you need to send in that next update. Share your budget format with your analyst ahead of time, and CB really prefers spreadsheets. We see agencies that like to put column or charts in their APD document, and it's so easy for things to get out of sync, for numbers in your chart not to be updated when changes are made on the spreadsheet or vice versa. Most of the time we need to go through and check numbers and make sure that we're coming up with the same figures. It just saves time, if you provide us the budget and a spreadsheet. Next slide, please. This suggestion is to remind you really to work on your outstanding conditions, throughout your APD period. Sometimes it's been amazing to us. We think our letters are pretty clear, but it's easy to misunderstand what a condition means. You get it and you think, oh, we think, Children's Bureau thinks, oh, it's pretty clear what that means. State gets it and thinks, oh, it's clear. But once we start talking about it, and if you wait to talk about it, all the way until your APD is due, and there's a big misunderstanding about what that means, it just wastes everybody's time and leaves everyone with a bad feeling. So take the time to go over those conditions. When you get a letter back and you think they're still clear, still ask for time. Say, hey, can we just go over these? I want to make sure I understand them. Set goals for when you want to talk about those outstanding conditions with your analyst. So maybe, you might not have all of them resolved, but just say, okay, look, I've got it on my calendar. 6 months from now, we're going to go over, what this condition is and where we are with resolving it. If you have a condition and you just think, I have no idea basically how we're going to address this condition, that's the kind of thing really you should talk to Children's Bureau about. We don't have technical assistance for everything, but we do have, the ability to provide technical assistance through our support contract and through other, mechanisms. And as we said, we really are here to help. So if you get a condition and you're just really stuck about how you're going to meet it, then that's something you really should be talking with your analyst about. And keeping track of the status of those conditions, over time is also going to save you time and save us time. Next slide, please. Okay, we didn't really want to leave on a negative note, but we are kind of getting to the end of this presentation, and we wanted to talk about things to avoid. And we're sure that none of you would try these things. They're all hypothetical things that might happen, but we just wanted to share them just the same. So next slide, please. So it's a red flag, when you're on a call and your analysts ask a pretty basic question about your APD and there's crickets, nobody answers, or the answer is, we need to, get back to you on that. I mean, it's understandable. Some things you may need to, get back to CB about, but we do expect you to understand the APD that you've turned in, and so if every time we ask a question, you need to go through 4 or 5 different, entities or people or groups to get an answer to that, that's kind of a red flag to us. Sometimes, we want to make sure that when you're describing your project initiatives that they reflect an understanding of what CCWIS requires and an understanding of the child welfare program. It doesn't happen a lot, but you'd be surprised to know, when we see APDs that are talking all about child support functionality or Medicaid functionality or these kinds of things because someone has used a template, from somewhere else and not really updated it to make sure that the APD addresses CCWIS. This next one too, we have APDs that really don't commit to anything. They just talk very at a high level about things that are going to happen or they would like to happen, but there's no timelines or any steps, or method in terms of resources for how you're going to achieve, what you've told us you're going to do. That's another red flag. We talked a little bit already about, saying what we've done and where our challenges are. And sometimes we see this where there may be, you're just copying that APD from one year to the next, and there's really not any updates on the current status. We would like you not to do that. Next slide. We talked about this, it's a red flag when we see inconsistent dates or budget figures or project information about contracts. And in one part of the document, it's saying one thing and somewhere else, in the document or an attachment saying something else. Those are red flags, that are going to create delays, in being able to approve your document. This next one, if we've taken the time to review a draft, again, we give a lot of technical assistance. You're not required, always to follow all the technical assistance. But if it's clear we've spent quite a bit of time, giving you information about how to improve the APD or how to address an issue in an APD, and you just send it back to us basically and ignore, everything that we've asked you to do, again, that's going to create delays, and probably your analyst is going to be a little less likely to spend a whole lot of time giving you technical assistance about how to improve your document. If you use another agency's language verbatim, and it's not applicable or it's not tailored to your project, it's a red flag. Sometimes we see states that are still thinking that we're in the CCWIS world and they're still, just using the format that they used under CCWIS, and they get irritated, when we're asking for things that are required under CCWIS, whether it's the data quality plan and the automated function checklist. And, we've moved. If you're relying on a format that you use during CCWIS, CCWIS is different than CCWIS, and there are different requirements. So, your APD format probably needs to be updated, to reflect what's required under CCWIS. We do sometimes get APDs that have lots and lots and lots of pages, and sometimes attachments that aren't organized, where we're trying to understand, why do I have this attachment and how does it relate, to one of the requirements, and you're kind of doing a lot of hunting and trying to piece things together. When that happens, I mean, there may be a belief that, CB has so many APDs, they're not going to be able to pay that much attention to mine. But I can assure you, when that happens, that's a red flag to us. And so what we do is set up additional reviewers, for that. So instead of getting less time, paid to your APD, you're going to get more, because we're looking at it thinking, why in the world does this APD, look like this and have this many pages? And you can't figure out what's going on, then I must need, more people than me basically to be looking at this document. If you're using a lot of buzzwords, again, we just want clarity. We don't need everything to be fancy. We just want to understand what it is you want to do, when you think you're going to do it and what it's going to cost. If you're constantly relying on waivers, or you want expeditious review, we try to do things timely. But if you haven't, done things on the project and this is a constant, you need 24-hour turnaround, 3-day turnaround, a week turnaround, all of the time, or a waiver because something didn't happen that needed to happen, and that's just a way of life. You know, we're going to get less and less flexible if that's just a given, if it's an excuse really for just not having things done on time. Okay, next slide. Okay, I hope some of that I hope some of that was helpful to you. And again, we want this to be open-ended. So I'm hoping, I haven't been able to look at the Q's and A's, but you all really are the experts at this work. And you know what the reality is in your agency in terms of what's doable and what you struggle with. So we do appreciate it when states share information. So if you have other ideas about strategies that you use, to make this process go smoothly, when we do the Q's and A's, please feel free to share those.
Hey, Teresa, this is Nick. We do have a few questions, and I think Nicole is also going to open up her line as well so that she can respond to them too. So if you don't mind, I'm going to walk through the questions that we have, and we also have another comment that was made on content earlier in the presentation. So the first question that I want to ask is, do you only do an as-needed APD for an implementation APD, or would you also possibly do an as-needed APD for an operational APD? And I think Nicole is going to answer that question, please.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I thought I answered it in the chat as well, but that applies to both an OAPD or an IAPD. It's anytime there's a change in the system's scope, concept, cost, schedule, cost allocation methodology, or project acquisitions.
Thank you very much. And this is Nick again. We received several questions throughout the presentation asking if we would make the presentation available for folks. And once it goes through the Section 508 process, we will share both the presentation and the video recording. We have recorded this webinar on our website. So hopefully that will respond to folks' needs there. The next question that we have is, it's inquiring about the status of the CCWIS self-assessment tools. Have they been finalized yet?
No, they haven't been finalized. I think I mentioned that we have been reviewing the comments that we received for the 6 that were issued. We're very close to finalizing the first draft of those. I think we've shared that those documents will be updated, as we use them. But the beta version, the first version, we're very close to finalizing those. And then, the next series of those that will be released after those are finalized are pretty far along. Many of you have been helping us develop those. And again, we appreciate that. If you're interested, in looking at a draft or, sharing feedback with us, please let your analysts know. Again, we want these to be useful. But I would say, we're about 95% done, with incorporating the changes based on the feedback that we received. So we're getting close, to finalizing this the first 6, but thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. As a reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions, you may please submit them via the question and answer box that you can find. It's either at the top or the bottom of your screen. I apologize, my screen looks a little bit different, so I can't visualize it right now. And or in addition, you may use the raise hand feature if you prefer to ask your question over the phone. We're monitoring that as well. I'm now going to take the time to ask the next question, Teresa. We received a question, can someone please provide the duplication definition as it relates to child welfare contributing agency?
Yeah, I think really for that one, I would go to the policy manual. I don't know, I know in the preamble for the rule itself, there are some descriptions of, duplication. And I know, I'm honestly not sure if we do have a Q&A, but mostly we are, working on that in terms of providing more guidance but it isn't something that is defined, specifically in the reg as it's written right now. Again, I think there may also be some things in the CWCA technical bulletin that could be helpful with that. And is that technical bulletin 2? I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But that may be something that if folks want, we could also, share that technical bulletin. We can take it back. It sounds like there's an interest in that. We'll take that back.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So the next question that I have, this is actually more a comment from earlier in the presentation that I thought was important to share. And what it says is that the details of the skills and resources needed to complete an APD or advanced planning document that we mentioned would be really important to document or show that it's important for state leadership to be aware of. And it's also helpful for state leadership to know that that's something that's supported by the Administration for Children and Families. This particular attendee expressed that they've run into issues where it's assumed that they can put more people or staff toward developing an advanced planning document to get it done faster. But for those state staff that are core to developing them, they believe that it's critical to have people who know the business and the technology and project process knowledge, in addition to the project manager type skill set and the understanding of the various components of advanced planning documents.
Thanks.
As a reminder,
we can include.
Go ahead, Teresa.
I was just going to say we can include that, in a technical bulletin, coming up, or in something. So that's good feedback for us. We'd be happy to provide more information about that.
As a reminder to folks, if you are interested in asking a question, you may do so now, either via the question and answer option. You may use the chat function, or you may raise your hand. I'm looking around and I don't see any more questions right now. Perhaps we'll give folks another minute and then we can transition to the next slide.
Okay, so I think you can see our contact information. Most of you know us. And if you have, again, if you're doing practices that you think might be helpful to others, please let us know. Or if there are particular items as you've done today, it sounds like duplication and maybe more information about the kinds of skill sets, that would be needed in order for staff to do a good job with the APDs. Happy to do that. Did want to give folks an opportunity if I know lots of you who are out there, you do have good ideas about how to do these. So if anybody wants to share, or if anyone has any other questions, we will stay on just a little bit longer. Otherwise, we will give you back some time for the rest of your day.
This is Nick. Teresa, I don't see any other questions in the chat right now or in the question and answer box.
Thank you.
Wait, we just received a comment. Thank you very much. and I believe we can wrap up at this time.
Okay, and we did include a resource list at the end of this presentation that you might find helpful, just to make it easy for you, to have this information in one place. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for everyone who participated. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.